Hello and welcome to one of the lectures for the Stanford Responsible Conduct of Research course. My name is Holly Tabor and I'm an Associate Professor in the Department of Medicine and Associate Professor of the Stanford Center for Biomedical Ethics for Clinical Ethics and Education. Today's video lecture will be on the topic of research misconduct and research integrity. So in general, we think of two main pillars of research ethics. The first is responsible conduct of research, and the second is informed consent. We're not going to really be covering informed consent in this lecture. We're going to talk about it in one of the other RCR video lectures that you will watch. So when we think about responsible conduct of research in general, we think of research integrity, and it sounds like an obvious point to make, but when we think about research integrity, we think about researchers and scientists and people who are involved in the conduct of research having no misconduct. And what is misconduct? So misconduct is generally thought of as being fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism. Sometimes that's also called FFP, in proposing, performing, or reviewing research or reporting research results. Fabrication is generally thought of as making up data or results and recording them or reporting them. Falsification is manipulating research materials, methods, and results, and changing or omitting data so that research is not accurately reflected in the record. And plagiarism should be familiar to everyone who's watching this, is the appropriation of another person's ideas or their work or their results or their words without appropriate credit or attribution. So when we think about FFP in the context of research and research ethics, FFP must be done intentionally, knowingly, or recklessly, and it's really considered to be a very significant departure from practices of the research community. In general, it's largely seen as an individual characteristic. They're individual bad actors who are choosing to undertake FFP. And in general, one of the reasons that people take RCR courses and institutions provide RCR courses and funding institutions require RCR courses for trainees is the thought that the teaching of RCR courses will help avoid the problematic behaviors among these individuals who depart from the practices of the research community in committing FFP. So why are we trying to have RCR courses teach researchers and people involved in science to not have FFP? There are a couple of reasons. The first is that research misconduct, really undermines trust in science and the public trust in science in particular. A lot of incidents of FFP get a lot of press. The general public hears about them and knows about them, and it makes people mistrust science, mistrust the results of science, and not be willing to participate in science, and also not support the funding of science. It's also, FFP is usually unambiguous. It's usually clear-cut that something wrong has been done. It's easily documented, and it's really usually clearly deserving of serious sanctions. And in general, it's considered to be very rare. Like I said, these incidents tend to get a lot of public attention and are very high profile. It's generally not to be thought of as very common, but even though it's not common, it often has the perception in the public eye of being more characteristic of science in general, even if in fact that's not true. So what I like to talk about when I talk about trying to avoid FFP and trying to have responsible conduct of research without FFP is what we think of as facepalm bioethics. It should be obvious to almost any of us who are involved in science and those of you who are in the RCR course that you shouldn't do some of these things that are involved in FFP. In spite of that, there's still some bad actors who do it, but it really should be rather obvious and egregious and clearly wrong. So here's an example of a publicly known case of FFP. It was described in an article in Nature in 2010. It actually took place at the University of Michigan in 2010. There was an MD PhD student at a comprehensive cancer center who was working on a study of epidermal growth factor receptor. And one of the other postdocs in the lab was captured on video systematically and intentionally sabotaging her experiments. And when they asked this postdoc why he did it, he said, "I just got jealous of others moving ahead and wanted to slow them down." They actually went to court, and the judge ordered the postdoc to serve probation, community service, have a psychiatric evaluation, and pay restitution. But while the amount of the restitution was being determined, the postdoc in question left the country, so none of the consequences could actually be implemented. In the article in Nature, which we'll put in the available readings for this section, the head of the lab and the students both talked about the impact that the situation had on them personally in their work, as well as their morale. And the student said that the experience shook her trust in her chosen profession. She said, "I did have doubts about continuing with science. It hurt my idea of science as a community that works together, builds upon each other's work, and collaborates." The article goes on to say that she's begun to use her experience, though, to help teach others, and she and her mentor, the lab head, are giving a seminar about the experience to new graduate students, and she says that doing that has helped her to cope with the ordeal and actually try to prevent other situations like that from happening to other people. So that's an example of FFP and that kind of research misconduct. So again, that should be pretty obvious to most of you who are listening to this lecture and taking this course. But the overall question I think is really important is FFP what scientists find troubling in terms of ethical challenges in conducting research? And so there's some empirical research that looks at the behaviors that scientists find questionable and that undermine trust and progress of science. And this research also looks at whether or not RCR courses like this one actually help, and whether questionable behaviors are a product of the individual, an individual characteristic, like I had said we thought FFP was, or the context in which those individuals work. So I want to tell you a little bit about a couple of studies that looked at that question. So this is a study by DeVries et al. From 2006, and they conducted six focus groups from several major research universities, geographically distributed with a range of professors and postdocs at different levels of their training, different disciplines. They organized the focus groups to try to minimize overlap within institutions and departments, and they had a 1.5 to 2 hour discussion about this topic. And what they found was that in general, the people they talked to were not really concerned about FFP or more sort of egregious cases of misconduct, but rather they had concern about what they considered to be more mundane ethical problems. And they grouped these in their analysis into 4 categories: the meaning of data, the rules of science, life with colleagues, and pressures of production science. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what they found with some examples. So here's a quote that fell in the category of scientists being concerned about behaviors related to the meaning of data and ethical challenges in that area. So this researcher said, okay, you've got the expected result 3 times on week 1 on the same preparation, and then you say, oh, great. And you go to publish it, and the reviewer comes back and says, I want a clearer picture. And you go and you redo it, and guess what? You can't replicate your own results. Do you go ahead and take that to a different journal? Was it false? Well, no, it wasn't false 1 week, but maybe I can't replicate it myself. There are a lot of choices that are gray choices. They're not really falsification. So again, this is not so clear. This is much more challenging and also much more common. Another quote that's an example of this concern about the meaning of data and interpretation of data. This researcher said, one gray area that I'm fascinated by is culling data based on your quote-unquote experience. Well, we have been doing this for 20 years. We know when we've got a spurious result. Do you go back and double check it, or do you just throw it out, and do you tell everybody that you threw it out? The people who were involved in these focus groups also talked about concerns about ethical challenges related to the rules of science. And a lot of this course is going to be talking about the rules of science, particularly rules about the protection of human subjects, the protection of animals, the control of materials like biohazards, allowable uses of grant funds. There are a lot of rules about that. And in general, the participants in these focus groups have made claims that the rules are unnecessary and intrusive, and that the rules themselves actually generate misconduct. And so here's an example of a quote that discusses that. This researcher said, if you ask why are the rules being bent, it's in some cases because too many rules have been implemented that obstruct you getting the necessary things done. There get to be so many rules, and you're doing anything you can to dodge around those rules without totally stepping over the line. They implement more rules, and then there's more individuals that do like, this is a ridiculous rule. How do I get around that? So this person's arguing that the rules themselves actually have the unintended consequence of encouraging scientists to figure out ways to get around the rules and bend boundaries and create ethical challenges. Another quote about the rules of science is describing a particular kind of trial. And this researcher said, half the physicians in our department will give medication 1 for headache, half will give medication 2 for headache. We have no reason to choose one over the other, so we want to do a study where we compare the 2. And we have to get consent, even though the patient was going to get one of the medications anyway. They're going to get one drug or the other anyway, and yet now they're having to read 3 pages and sign a form. So I'm sure there are people who try to get around that because it is a ridiculous request. So this this is a particular kind of research that gets done, but the challenge here then is that in order to do a study, we often have more paperwork and more obligations. Researchers perceive that to be a burden, and researchers sometimes try to figure out ways to get around that. A third category of sort of more mundane ethical challenges that the focus group participants talked about was life with colleagues. And things that fell in this category included record keeping and how to keep notebooks and letters of recommendation. And here are some exemplary quotes from this category. This participant said, "I think it's really unfortunate that there are so many rules about how we use radioactivity, how we use these animals, but there aren't many guidelines that train scientists on how to design experiments, how to keep notebooks." And that's definitely a theme that we hear often from participants in the RCR course, that sometimes they don't feel like they get enough training and guidance on how to keep notebooks and how to keep track of data, and that there's some anxiety sometimes about talking to mentors about getting guidance on that. Another quote in this category was, "We have to navigate very carefully in order not to burn bridges and derail long-term research projects. It's very complex." And these issues about relationship building and concerns about letters of recommendation also come up a lot in the context of the responsible conduct of research and these sort of more quote-unquote mundane categories of ethical challenge. The fourth category that was identified through the focus groups was pressures of production in science. And the participants talked a lot about how researchers manipulate the review system. They talked about what they considered to be improper control of the research by the funders. They talked about disputes about authorship, and we have another section of RCR that talks about this, both in the video lectures and in the cases that you'll discuss during the in-person session. Unreported conflicts of interest, we also have another section on that in the RCR course. And actual exploitation, theft, and control of ideas. So these are concerns that they raised that they felt came out of the pressures on scientists and on the scientific institutions to actually produce and publish results from the various different projects and grants that investigators have. And here are some quotes. One researcher said, "When I left my postdoc, I was told, 'Don't compete with me, you won't win.' And it was a given that you wouldn't win." So that person felt like they were sort of discouraged and intimidated from doing work in their field, and that was sort of a gray area of research ethical challenges. This other quote said, "I'm always wary of submitting grants to study sections because those people who sit on the study sections, it's not unknown for them to take your ideas, kill your grant, and then take it and do it." So again, this is part of the pressures of production that was cited. So after this study, Martinson et al. Did a study following up NIH-funded researchers, and they asked them about 33 misbehaviors ranging from fairly innocuous behaviors to serious behaviors, and they surveyed both mid-career scientists and early career scientists and got a response rate of about 40 to 50% across those they surveyed, for a combined number of 3,247 responses. And so this is a slide showing the different kinds of behaviors that they had and that they talked about. And of note, if you look at number 6, unauthorized use of confidential information in connection with one's own research, there was a significant difference between mid-career and early career respondents, with mid-career respondents saying that they had engaged in this behavior within the previous 3 years. Also with number 8, circumventing certain minor aspects of human subject requirements, there was a significantly larger proportion of mid-career scientists who said that they did that. And then changing the design methodology or results of a study in response to pressure from a funding source, or number 10, that also had 20.6% of mid-career scientists saying they'd done that in the last 3 years, compared to 9.5% of early career scientists, which is still rather high. The other one of these top 10 behaviors that was fairly common among both categories was number 8, circumventing certain minor aspects of human subject requirements. So clearly, human subjects requirements was one of the areas where both kinds of respondents said that they had engaged in that behavior, and where there was a significant difference between mid-career and early career respondents. Some of the other behaviors that were not top 10 in terms of the being top 10, but were other kinds of behaviors that were surveyed of the respondents. Publishing the same data or results in 2 or more publications, 5.9% of mid-career and 3.4% of early career, and that was a statistically significant difference. Inappropriately assigning authorship credit, withholding details of methodology or research in papers or proposals, and again, for all of those, there was a significant difference. So again, this is to say that these are the kinds of behavioral challenges that researchers worry about and that researchers actually say that they participate in. And these are not FFP for the most part. As you can see in the top 10 behaviors, very few said they falsified or cooked the research data, number one. Very few said that they ignored major aspects of human subjects requirements. So it's really important to think about how this should affect how we think about the responsible conduct of research as individual scientists and researchers, but also how we think about how we teach it and how we talk about it. And that's just highlighting the sections from before. So, as I said, we have to think about how we teach this. So another empirical question is, do training courses and mentoring make a difference? So there was a study by Anderson et al. From 2007 that looked at the correlation between training courses, mentoring, and engaging in these so-called misbehaviors. They found that early career researchers were no less likely to report engaging in questionable behaviors if they took courses in research ethics, whether those courses were separate or integrated. When they looked at mid-career professionals, neither separate nor integrated coursework had an impact alone, but combined, they lowered the odds of reported problematic behavior in some areas. And the study also found that mentorship showed positive and negative impact on early career researchers. So this is a little bit of a mixed result, right, in terms of whether or not training courses help and whether or not mentorship helps. Ethics mentoring lowered the odds of questionable behavior in the areas of methods and cutting corners. So mentoring played a difference in that category. Research mentoring lowered the odds of questionable behavior in areas of data, methods, use of funds, and cutting corners. Personal mentoring lowered the odds of questionable behavior in areas of methods, outside influence, and peer review. And financial survival mentorship increased the odds of problematic use of funds, methods, and peer review. So they actually looked at these subcategories and basically found that there's not one kind of mentoring. Different kinds of mentoring actually address or more successfully address different kinds of problems and different kinds of problematic behaviors and ethical challenges. Martinson et al. Looked at scientists' perceptions of organized justice and self-reported misbehaviors. So they looked at two kinds of justice, and it's worth taking a second to define these different kinds of justice. Distributive justice is fairness in the distribution of resources as an organizational outcome. In other words, it's the ratio of the perceived effort to the reward in your work. Procedural justice, in contrast, is fairness in processes and procedures used to determine the distribution of resources. So some examples of that are the top people in my field are successful because they are more effective at working the system. The peer review system of evaluating proposals for research grants is by and large unfair. It greatly favors members of the old boy network. So those would be examples of there not being procedural justice. Okay, so when you think about those definitions, they asked scientists what they thought about which of these was operating. And in general, they found that distributive injustice is positively correlated with misbehavior among early career scientists, but not overall among all the scientists. And procedural justice correlates with greater degree of misbehavior overall, both among early and mid-career scientists who they surveyed. So I think the conclusion here is that both distributive injustice and procedural injustice matter, but procedural injustice maybe matters more and matters more across different kinds of scientists at different stages in their career. So in summary, scientists' conception of misbehavior and issues of concern are far broader than fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism, or the sort of more egregious kinds of misconduct. There's definitely some empirical data that more rules, even though there are good reasons to have those rules, may actually make things worse or make things worse in some situations and have unintended consequences. Unfortunately, RCR courses as they're currently constituted may be of limited value, or they may be of limited value on their own. I think RCR courses like this one can do important work, but they can't do all the work. And they only do work at the times that you take the RCR course, not necessarily in the ongoing ethical dilemmas and challenges that researchers face at different points in their daily work. Mentoring can matter. Not all mentoring works. Not all mentoring or all different kinds of mentoring solve all problems. I'm actually of the opinion that mentoring can make a very big difference, not just during your training period, but throughout your career, which I'll mention in a second. And integrity is a product of institutional culture and structure, not merely individual character. You'll remember we said that FFP was generally considered to be an individual characteristic of certain individual bad actors. I think in general, research integrity, and particularly the kinds of more subtle behaviors that the other articles talked about, is much more related to institutional culture and structure, both of the institutions we work in on a micro and macro level, but also in terms of science as a whole. And in general, systemic injustice breeds problematic behavior. Behavior isn't just an individual characteristic, it's also a characteristic of the environments in which we work. So I just want to end with a couple of points. There are several research ethics resources at Stanford. If you have research ethics questions of either the FFP variety or of the more mundane variety. In particular, there is a research ethics consultation service, a bedside ethics consultation service, and this is a picture of the website. You can look it up online. And it assists investigators of all levels with ethical issues in the design or conduct of a study, that should say or. For example, a consultation could help with analyzing the impacts of a particular policy on the conduct of bench science, identifying the ethical or social impacts of conducting a particular line of research, suggesting specific actions to minimize risks and maximize benefits to society, but it also can help with many other kinds of things and other kinds of issues. It's not necessarily the best venue for some of the more sort of FFP categories of research misconduct, but for things related to design and study and other kinds of issues that arise, at least calling the benchside ethics consultation service to see if they might be able to help is certainly a reasonable thing to do. Any member of the Stanford University community can use the service, including investigators, PIs, or anyone on the research team, study participants, coordinators, faculty, staff, students, IRBs, regulatory committees, and so forth. The identities of those requesting consultations and the information that they share are confidential with the permission of the people requesting the consultation. Sometimes we ask to use de-identified descriptions of the cases for educational purposes, like, for example, RCR. So this is definitely one of several possible resources that's available to the Stanford community. Examples of the kinds of benchside ethics consultation are listed here. These are just some of the examples. And I just want to make the point again that the service is not designed to replace the Human Subjects Panel, IRB, the Stem Cell Research Oversight Committee, or any other institutional or regulatory body. And if you have certainly more egregious kinds of concerns, sometimes those are best addressed by those institutional regulatory bodies, but certainly the benchside ethics consultation service could help direct people to the appropriate place if there are concerns about that. So I just wanted to end by making sort of a take-home message, which is that I think that ethical science is lifelong, career-long, and evolving. This is actually a picture of my grandfather, who was a biochemist who worked in science for a very long time. The picture on the left is him in 1944. The picture on the right is of him in the early 2000s. And he's always been an example to me, and I've seen this in my own work and in students who I've had and in other mentors that I've had, that research ethics and responsible conduct of research is not something that you learn in one point in time. It's not something that you fill your obligation to take the RCR course and then you're done. The kinds of questions that come up, both in terms of FFP, but also especially in terms of the more mundane questions, or questions that you're trying to figure out and need help from colleagues figuring out throughout the entire course of your career. So it's important to realize that it's a dynamic process. And then related to that, we talked about mentorship, and that mentorship can help. That mentorship isn't necessarily a cure-all of everything. The picture on the top left is me in 1991 during this summer when one of the first summers that I worked in a lab. And the other two pictures are pictures of my laboratory experience immediately after my PhD. And I just think it's important to talk about the different kinds of mentors you have from different stages in your careers, and that you draw on different kinds of mentors for different kinds of mentorship. And this applies to research, responsible conduct of research as well, that there will be certain kinds of ethical dilemmas, even more mundane dilemmas that you may come across. And that's a good time to draw on your network of mentors, to draw on your network of people, both past and present, who know you, who've had a lot of experience, perhaps with similar types of situations, and who can give you guidance about what to do. So thank you very much.